Hi, today we're going to talk about the last setting um, that we're going to specifically cover kind of in depth as far as our cameras go. We won't talk about it, or it shouldn't take you as long as the other activities did because you've already done it a couple of times. So you're getting good at it and efficient. So ISO is kind of our last topic here. So what is ISO? I feel like we should cover this, although you will never probably call ISO by the actual full name. So International Standards Organization. It's essentially measuring the amount of sensitivity to light in your camera. Um, so if we come back here to our exposure triangle that we've seen quite a few times now, we learned all about shutter speed and aperture, and now we're going to talk about this last little bit here, the ISO. So the lower the ISO number, the clearer your image, the higher the ISO, the grainier it is. And we'll sort of see that in our photos, but it's not as extreme as, or at least my photos, I couldn't notice it as well as these examples right here. But at least at the end of this activity, you'll be able to see it a little bit and you'll be able to adjust all of that. Um, all right, so let's talk about that. We need to get our camera settings all figured out again, and you know how to do all of this because we've done it a couple of times already. So I'll just breeze through these first few slides here pretty quick because you've done it already, so you know how to do it. So set your camera to manual on the mode dial. So that M at the top. You're going to start out with you're going to have your shutter speed set at 1/125th of a second for all of these photos. So mine here in this image shows 1/250th, but for this activity, we'll do 1/125th. Okay, to adjust that, turn the main dial, which is right under my finger in this photo right here. Just a little side note, I can see a fair amount of grain in this picture, and that's what we're going to talk about with the ISO. So especially in these darker areas here, the grain is more noticeable. We can see it a little bit in the lighter areas too, but this photo that I took right here must have had a high ISO number. Okay, we know what settings we're adjusting because of those little orange arrows. Again, I felt like I needed to leave all this information, sorry, in here just so that it's a good review and you are getting more and more efficient at changing your settings. And this probably takes you literally seconds now, whereas it used to probably take you quite a bit longer. So you're getting good at it. So we're going to change the aperture. We're gonna have that set at 5.6 for this activity. So here on my camera, you see it's f6.3, but we're going to have ours at f5.6. So we're going to start out with our ISO at 100, and then we're going to scroll through those settings, taking one picture at each of those settings. So you know how to adjust that, right? So you hit that little ISO button right there. Takes you to that next screen here. You should see this screen. We're going to start out at 100. Okay. All right. Our ISO. We're not going to worry about changing the focus points or anything like that for these photos because that's not a big deal for this one. But it's good that you know how to do it. So we did it in the last activity. So we're going to use those settings we just established. So 1/125th of a second for our shutter speed. Aperture is at f5.6, and those two settings will stay. And then the ISO is what will change. We're starting out at ISO 100. Okay, so your first photo, probably something like that. I took mine, again, in my office where I've taken all of these photos for these activities. And the lights are sort of moderate. I have a decent amount of natural light in here, but not a ton today because I did close my blinds. Okay, so there is my ISO 100 photo. Obviously, that one's pretty dark, right? So let's make some adjustments. All we're changing is the ISO and nothing else for this activity, just like we did with the first activities. So we're going to bump the ISO up to 200. So that should turn out something like that. So we're getting a little bit brighter, right? So same settings for everything else, just the ISO has changed up to 200. Okay, so still not enough light, so we're going to keep bumping up the ISO to 400. So that should turn out something like that right there. So it's getting brighter, obviously, right? All those other settings are exactly the same. Getting there. Okay, changing the ISO again, nothing else. We're going to keep increasing the ISO until we get to the max. So this time we are at 800 for our ISO, and now that's a pretty decently well lit photo. I would accept that one right there, right? Overall, it's pretty light, or pretty even, I should say. A nice level of brightness. We're not going to stop there though, because that's what this activity is for. So we're going to keep bumping that up. So we're changing the ISO, bumping it up again until we get to the max. So we have 1600 for this one. So that one's bright. I would say that one would be acceptable as well. What we would see if this photo were bigger would be more grain, and we'd probably see it first in these darker areas. You see that blurring of some of that background area just because of the aperture. Since we have that aperture set at a lower number, we get some blurring of the background. So that would be different from the grain that is introduced by that high ISO. Just so you're aware of that too. Okay, so next, again, all we're changing is the ISO. We're going to bump that all the way up to 3200. So again, we're getting it brighter and brighter as we go. So this is brighter than the one that was right before it. Okay, and we have one more to get to. So again, just ISO changing, nothing else. So here is our last one, and that is at our highest ISO that our camera will go to, which is 6400. So that's really bright, and you can see some of the grain there. It's hard to tell in these lighter areas because everything is so light. Okay, so if we are able to increase the brightness of our photos by bumping up the ISO, why don't we just keep it as high as possible all the time? And the answer to that is the higher the number, the grainier the photos. So it sounds good to have a really high ISO because it allows a lot more brightness to your photos. But the problem is when you get to the higher ISOs, you're introducing a lot of grain. So these are obviously very grainy, whereas the ones with the lower ISO, they would have a lot lower amount of grain. And that depends a lot on the camera that you're using. So the cameras that we're using are decent, right? But they're not top of the line. So if you were to get more towards the top of the line, one of the improvements that you will see there is that graininess is reduced. Okay, so now it's your turn. You are going to set up another still life. It can have one object or a couple. I had 3 in mind, so that's fine. Just make sure to keep the background pretty simple so we don't want to be distracted by all the things going on in the background. And you're going to take 7 photos for this one. Set your camera up the way I had mine at the beginning. So shutter speed at 1/125th of a second, aperture at f5.6, and the ISO starting at 100. So you're going to create another Google Doc or Google Slide presentation with your 7 photos and the settings that each one was captured using. Make sure you include the settings. So I want to know for each photo what settings you use. Make sure you include those labels with each and every photo. Obviously, the shutter speed and the aperture are going to stay the same, but that ISO will change. So make sure you note that in your slide. So your first slide should look something like this, like that. So we have a photo and then the settings. So make sure you include all of that information in your slide presentation. All right, if you have any questions at all, let me know. After we're done with this activity, now we're going to start on an actual photography project. So good job. Thanks for your patience with these setting activities. And now we will start on the fun stuff. All right, I'll see you later.